Hello, Wayne Pop 2021, and welcome to our roundtable discussion at the ruins of pop culture, trauma, disruptions, voids, and the show me power of visual narrative. I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher at Illinois State University. And joining me in today's discussion is an illustrious panel of trauma experts, psychologists, and philosophers. Panelists, please introduce yourselves, tell us something about your expertise and your favorite memory of the pop culture narrative you feel is most related to today's discussion. And going in alphabetical order, we'll begin with Dr. Vanessa Hintz.
Hello, Wayne Pop. My name is Dr. Vanessa Hintz. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist based in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. I would say, okay, so this is just at the forefront of my mind, but I recently saw the remake of Candyman, the sequel, the new Candyman, which I'm gonna try not to say that name anymore while we're on this.
Was that twice already?
I know, like, let's keep count. But I think, speaking of trauma, I mean, that and visuals, like that film, it was an experience. And so I'm very interested to hear what Dylan has to say and to see how I can tie that in, because a lot of my professional work, clinical work is around anti-Black racism. And so that is saying that out loud is a trauma in itself. So I'm very excited to get this discussion started. So welcome.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. And next, Dr. Leandra Paris.
Hi, so I'm Dr. Leandra Paris. I am a school psychologist and specialize in social justice and crisis intervention traumatology. I'm out here at William & Mary in Virginia. Yay. And as far as the memory, I think the first time I really got involved with doing stuff like this with Scott was over Supernatural and doing a lot of the childhood trauma. But as I was thinking about your work, I actually was thinking more about their dad, John Winchester, and how that goes through. And so I kind of always rely on them in Stranger Things. Those are my two go-tos for talking about this topic. So I have a lot of good memories and good discussion around that. So I'm looking forward to bouncing that around and seeing what you guys think.
Fantastic. And now, Dr. Dylan Trigg.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so my name is Dylan Trigg. I'm a researcher at the University of Vienna Department of Philosophy. I have an area of specialism in phenomenology and aesthetics and continental philosophy, and I write a lot on horror, anxiety, and nostalgia. And as to a memory or an episode that pertains to the theme of our talk, I mean, a lot of my work is on sort of quite grisly horror, sort of things like David Cronenberg, and a lot of it about sort of body horror. But actually, when I think about this theme, I think more of kind of childhood and films that had a formative effect on me in childhood. And one of those is, I think it's a Disney film. It's called Flight of the Navigator. It came out in 1986, and it articulates, it's a story about a little boy who's taken away by aliens, but at the heart of the film is something kind of more profound about the displacement of home, family, time, identity. And I didn't quite realize it at the time, but I think, thinking about it now, it is in a way informed some of the themes that I would later work on in a more adult capacity to some extent. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And it's fantastic how we find these things we fell in love with in childhood, adolescence, young adulthood showing up in our work later on. So the way the discussion is going to work is I've asked Dylan to say a few words about his research on the phenomenology of trauma memory and their relationship to this notion of ruins. From there, we'll all discuss pop culture narratives we feel address these notions while simultaneously revealing the show me power of these visual narratives. So Dylan, please, the floor is yours.
I want to thank you so much. So I'm going to introduce these themes in a indirect but narratological way. So I have just a little something that's pre-prepared, which I hope will give you an introduction and a sense of the themes at stake. 12 miles north of Washington, D.C., the ruins of White Flint Mall lie dormant on the landscape. Nothing much remains of the place now, except for the nearly deserted Lord & Taylor department store, the survival of which is only possible through annexing itself from the surrounding wasteland. Here and there, traces of White Flint's former glory can be found amongst the ruins, Fragments of Italian marble, discarded Pepsi cans from 1994 scatter the landscape like gems in a black cosmos. Conceived in 1977 and demolished in 2015, White Flint's 38-year lifespan has proved germane to a sense of nostalgia more commonly thought of in the context of a childhood home. When news of its imminent demolition started to spread, crowds gathered from all four corners of the United States in order to bear witness to the mall's final stand. Beneath the sky of decaying neon and faded pastel, the mall's atmosphere of easy consumerism was augmented with a mournful nostalgia. In the months prior to its demolition, the mall assumed a spectral dimension. Neither present nor past, the place entered something like a twilight zone. While the escalators and lifts continued to operate, they remained largely unoccupied, their motion serving no one in particular. In the mall's food court, there existed an eerie silence offset by the black drapes that covered the empty holes once occupied by Sparrow Pizza. I think that's how you pronounce it. Some of the hallways had now been sealed off with artificial doors, creating the impression of an abandoned film set. And mannequins that were once objects of admiration were now stockpiled in empty stores, their deconstructed naked bodies resting alongside discarded light fixtures and severed torsos. In 1989, White Flint Mall was a flurry of activity. In and around Tape World and Contempo Casuals, social cliques would form discrete gangs, each of which staked their territory against the backdrop of fried food. When they grew weary of the food court, they would seek sanctuary in the central plaza downstairs. Around the ornate water fountains, they formed a pact that would eventually transform the mall's innocuous milieu into a future site of ceremony. In adult life, the youthful dwellers of White Flint Mall would look back upon their old haunt with reverential awe. At night, when the world had fallen into silence, the image of White Flint Mall would flash like a burning ember in the memory of innocence. In cities and countries far removed, they would be able to remember the layout, odor, and taste of the mall with forensic detail. Freed of the tribulations of daily life, these middle-aged adults would travel back to the enchanted hallways, finding within them a kernel of truth about the people that they became. Our relationship with memory and place is complex. Far from a background against which life takes place, much less a geometric sphere that orbits our life in a neutral way, place is laden with meaning and significance, such that the sense of who we are is irreversibly tied up with the places that we remember. The case of a nostalgia for a shopping mall is edifying in this sense. How, after all, is it that a shopping mall, which is ostensibly thought of as a place lacking memorable qualities, can become an object of nostalgia as central to the life of a person as that of the home itself? In fact, this nostalgia for shopping malls is neither novel nor entirely new. A fascination with so-called dead malls has been documented since the year 2000, if not before. As the term indicates, dead malls refers to indoor malls, largely though not exclusively populating the American landscape, in a state of irreversible decline, both economically and socially. Depopulated, if not yet wholly abandoned, their appearance on the landscape gestures towards a past that is no longer accessible, save as a trace that refuses to be consolidated into history. The term itself, however, is rather misleading. Not yet dead, these empty malls tend to exert an atmospheric influence upon those whose formative years were spent in and around artificial flora and fauna, ornate water fountains, and brightly lit food courts. As evidence of this burgeoning nostalgia, an entire aesthetic worldview has flourished over the last decade or so, which reveres the image of the mall as an exemplary figure of a lost innocence. Nowhere is this clearer, arguably, than in the recent popular media, such as Netflix's Nostalgia Fest, Stranger Things. In particular, in season 3 of Stranger Things, the fictional Starcourt Mall, filmed in the actual defunct Gwinnett Place Mall in Georgia, Atlanta, serves as both a location, but also a loving tribute to an environment that is no longer accessible, except in the form of a nostalgic fever dream formed with a mixture of memory and fiction. The plot follows the lives of a group of teenagers combating malevolent forces. However, nothing more needs to be said on this, because what is at stake is not the dramatic arc of a piece of entertainment, but more the articulation of a shopping mall as a constitutive and formative element in the identity of a person or a group of people. Stranger Things is, of course, not the first time, and far from the last, to feature a mall as a central theme. From Fast Times at Ridgemount High to Day of the Dead, malls have assumed a pivotal role in the history of cinema and television over the last 40 years or so. Yet only now, as they are rapidly entering a phase of extinction, have malls undergone a shift in their representation and understanding. Instead of being the tacit backdrop against which life takes place, they are now emblematic of a certain longing for lost time. So, as it is lovingly reproduced in Stranger Things, the mall embodies as much a locale as it does an ideal. And to understand how this idealized version of malls has come into fruition, it's necessary here to think about how mallstalgia more broadly and more specifically about the everydayness of the mall as it is understood through the lens of nostalgia. So just a quick reflection on this. In its average everyday function, the mall presents itself as an innocuous figure of the background. It is, for the most part, an impersonal collection of parking lots, elevators, shop fronts, food courts, and insipid furnishings. More than this, it is a cocoon, sealed off from the concerns of the surrounding world and inoculated against the dangers of life beyond. This arrangement is not, of course, peculiar to one mall, but is instead replicated in each and every mall. Every mall is a duplicate of the other, each providing a sanctum in an otherwise hostile world, with little to distinguish one mall from the other. And then the mall begins to die. And yet, instead of falling into silence, another life begins. Depopulated, the bland furnishings, insipid decor, and empty storefronts protrude from the landscape, and in doing so generate a new presence forged from the ruins of memory. The result is something like a dreamlike atmosphere that transforms the everyday from a site of banality to a world saturated with meaning that is not easy to place. Found objects of a lost culture, broken arcade machines, artificial water fountains, faded neon signs, and so on and so forth, bear witness to a renewed sense of place, now freed of any domestic attachments. These totems of an irretrievably lost age appear not as a continuum, but as a rupture in the field of perception, deforming the boundary line between the here and the there. This distortion of presence is no less true of time. Amongst the empty food courts and semi-flickering neon, the past, such as it is not a field of experience behind us, but instead an always overlapping vapor trail of memories that seeps into the present. Entire worlds that belong in 1987 form a shadow line visible in the present. In parallel, pastness is materialized only through becoming a vanishing point in the present, while absence and presence occupy the same synthetic landscape. No longer clear and distinct, the living and the dying are instead transformed into a series of subdivisions of the same order of existence. Such then is the lesson that Stranger Things teaches us. To conduct a phenomenology of star-caught mall, we would need to address the ways in which banal places are transformed to sites of meaning through the lens of nostalgia. We would need to consider how the representation and reproduction of malls plays upon a nostalgia for a time that is irretrievable. And we would need to examine how ruins, be it digital or actual, generate the grounds for reimagining another past that is coexistent with the present. Indeed, the very existence of Starcourt Mall, as a reconstruction of a mall within a dead mall, attests to the complex intertwinement between the fictitious realm of make-believe and the real, all too real desire to relive a past that was never present to begin with. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much for that. What I'm going to quickly do here is follow up on something you said about memory being present in experience. Vanessa and Leandra and I, we've worked together a lot, and one of the things they're probably tired of hearing me talk about is the fact that the way the brain is organized, it turns out that every aspect of our cortex, every aspect involved in perceiving, acting, and thinking shares a recursive relationship with the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is a much phylogenetically older aspect of the brain. And it turns out the way it works is that these memories of what's happened and what I was doing, these become stored in the cerebellar cortical loops. And what this means is that at every moment of my life, my memories are being projected. My memories of my actions, my thoughts, and my perceptions are being projected into the present as an expectation about the future. You experience, I call these multi-scale stories we're telling ourselves that we don't know are telling ourselves, but from a phenomenological perspective, what they're doing is providing what I'll call an unconscious background against which events can be foregrounded. And we don't know. The beauty of the brain is you don't know that these unconscious narratives are being projected and they're framing your experience. And that's precisely what we see ourselves working at when we talk about things like unconscious bias. One of my missions, one of my things right now is to bring this understanding of our brains and this understanding of ourselves, this understanding of our phenomenology to the table, to have us have versions of our lived life where we understand that we're living in stories about where we've been and what we've done. And the only way to change those stories is to change the present, so it becomes the new unconscious story later. So, I see this as a real nice interface between, your take on the phenomenology of memory, the phenomenology of place, and the sorts of things I'm trying to talk about in terms of living and identity as multi-scale narrative.
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for that rich elaboration. And I think, it raises, I think, a series of tensions that is certainly concerns my work, even if it's not often or explicitly articulated. And that's an ethical question about what are we doing with these stories, and also to what extent are the biases with which we operate in a way nullifying other stories and nullifying other narratives. I think, the more that I conduct research on nostalgia, one of the things that concerns me is the extent to which nostalgic perception and nostalgic narratives have the role of reducing other narratives and reducing other modes of time to a level of sameness, reducing it to a level of sort of egocentric perspective of my own history, and anything that doesn't sort of conform to this history is either perceived as a threat or perceived as something to be rejected. And of course, this is very evident politically and in a very pernicious way when nostalgia is employed ideologically, to call upon these sort of grand narratives of how things ought to be, and against which the present is seen as a sort of deviation of this kind of normative marker. So I think one of the things, and I think not only, I mean, it's kind of easy to perceive it on a political level, but in a way it's more insidious, and it's in a way more pernicious on a personal level, because it's harder to grasp. We are so accustomed to nostalgia. I think especially like over the last year and a half or so since COVID has arrived, there's just been this sort of surge in nostalgia, and I think there's always a series of blind spots that we have with our own nostalgia, because it plays such a constitutive role in who we are. And I think that's fine. I'm not sort of necessarily opposed or anti nostalgia, but I do think that there is a point of saturation where it creates a myopic vision of how the world is and how the world ought to be. And of course, it's inflamed not only by COVID, but also by social media, where you have these sort of trends of how the ways in which the past is articulated, and also the very recycling of the past itself. And I think, Stranger Things occupies a kind of slightly peculiar terrain there, because it is a loving recreation of this era, and I don't think there's anything necessarily pernicious about it. But it does feed into, you know, a certain hunger, I think, that was already there. And I think, you know, on a sort of personal or on a sort of psychological level, it can lead to a sort of a resistance towards otherness and, you know, things that do not conform to this narrative. So yeah, I mean, I'd certainly be interested in how other people figure out navigating that terrain between memory, nostalgia, and ethics more generally.
What I was gonna say is, I think it's so interesting as you were talking, both Dylan and Scott, as you were talking, I was thinking about, because I'm a practicing psychologist, a clinical psychologist. So in therapy, 99% of the issues that people come in for, at the core of it, is exactly what you just described. Like, how do I integrate? How do I show up authentically, given that there's so much that I'm inundated with, culturally, all of these things, right? And so 99% of what I do with clients in therapy is really to get them to sort through. I think you described it, Dylan, as those blind spots of, we talk about in Leandra, when people should themselves to death, like, I should do this, I must do this, I have to do this. Like, that's something that we work with. And so whenever I am confronted with a client who, I should do this, my question is always like, why? What makes you feel that way? Not that you should or shouldn't, but tell me what informs that thought. And so what we're ostensibly trying to get down to, because I definitely would categorize myself as an existential phenomenological psychologist. And so what I'm hoping to do in therapy with folks is get them to understand that system of making meaning, that system of valuing, and understanding how that is influenced by the larger context, right? So one that comes up a lot is, and again, these are gross generalizations, but one that comes up a lot is, women feeling like they can't be, explore themselves sexually, because if they do, that means something negative about them, that devalues them in a way. And so working with, women and men, working with folks who, how do you undo that? How do you undo that learning? And I think that first it starts with identifying how this became part of your process. How did this become part of your value system? Is it something that you believe in your heart of hearts? And or is it something that you were told to believe in? Now there's that dissonance, because it's almost like you were describing dissonance of this is how it should be versus how I feel. And so, yes.
I love that point too. You bring up is in terms of like sexuality and gender identity, because I think it is part of that is nostalgia. Because you grew up, some of us, with a man and a woman in the kitchen making breakfast in the morning, and the kids running around with the 2.5 kids and the dogs. And so like in your mind, that nostalgic Saturday morning family routine involved a male father and a female mother. And so I do think nostalgia kind of comes into that a little bit, because it creates the should, right? You don't know that that's what you've internalized as the should be, instead of being able to really kind of open it up and say, it wasn't about male or female or mom and dad, it was about the love, it was the process, and so I think that I see that a lot with teenagers. Because everything that happens between like 9 and 13 becomes like how it should always be, right? And so really having to go through and say, like, you don't have to be homecoming queen with the captain of the football team. You can be whatever, right? That should thing. And so I think that I just love that point that you both made there. So I like how you pull that together.
And then when you guys are working with people, part of what you need to, I suspect, is you need to induce repetition in trying out these new narratives. And this is what the behaviorists got right? Do it over, generate these new consequences you've not generated in the past. Do it long enough and it'll become how you think about yourself. But I think in at least in American culture, I don't know about the rest of them, but we tend to overcognize our ability to solve. All I gotta do is think it the right way and it'll be the right way. And no, you have to be that way. And as you practice being that way, it'll come to be. Dylan, this thing you said about blind spots, right? And then when you talked about Stranger Things as kind of a nostalgic pill, dead on, right? in the sense that whose stories are we not telling because we're telling this one? So let's look at the cast of Stranger Things. It's a typical Spielberg cast, bunch of white kids and one black person, right? Recapitulating that 70s movie vibe, right? And it's so sweet. It's like having a bowl of candy, and you don't know that there's all kinds of other lives that were being lived. And not only do you not know that there were all kinds of other lives being lived while that movie that was made that were different, this movie, this experience is actually constraining you from seeing those. And I would say that is actually part of the curse of being, in the sense that, as I said earlier, we cannot see outside of memory. We cannot see outside of the past constraining our present view. What we need to do is actually have the world be disrupted. And that's usually how it happens. The world's disrupted independent of us, and therefore shocks our memories. And then we reorganize, or we go see a therapist and we work to actually get ourselves reorganized by having someone else prod our memory and push us to be different. So yeah, I like that idea of the curse. And that's not a bad thing. I love it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think you've kind of highlighted the ambiguity there of being drawn in, being seduced by this atmospheric, nostalgic force, but at the same time having this uneasy sense that it is indeed excluding other narratives and, you know, conditioning the way in which we view things. And I think in a way, for me, it's problematized by the way that nostalgia is understood and represented in popular media, and that's, I think, underpinned by the construction or the formulation of nostalgia within empirical psychology. So there's this big work, this big kind of pool of research that's being done right now in the UK about the positive psychological effects of nostalgia in terms of generating well-being, and then it sort of, you know, there's a long list of various attributes of what nostalgia can do to us. There's this movement in the UK of empirical psychologists formulating the idea of nostalgia as an emotion that contributes to well-being in a number of different ways. And that's been fed, I think, into the media. And as I say, especially over the last year or so, where nostalgia is presented as an antidote to some of the anxieties surrounding COVID and surrounding other sorts of transitional moments. But I think it also, one of the dangers of that is that it overlooks and it neglects the way in which nostalgia can also contribute to suffering, that it can also lead to a sense of alienation from time, from other people, and indeed this sense of being isolated and hemmed in within one's private world, you know, at the expense of engaging within the world more generally. And I think, you know, the kind of the syrupy, sentimental nostalgia that you find, I think, in things like Stranger Things and in a lot of the other kind of Netflix productions, does tend to play into that. It does sort of, you know, there isn't, I think, an element of manipulation that sets the viewer up for a certain kind of sense of resolution that is often linked to some sort of sense of like nostalgic return, which I think is problematic on a number of levels.
And I'm happy that you said that, because I feel like I was sitting here thinking about the word nostalgia and how I feel it in my mind, it has a connotation of like a positive experience. So like if I'm nostalgic, it's inducing those positive feelings in me. Because I was sitting here thinking about, you know, just being a Black person in America. And like when I think about the 80s, which I'm not even going to say when I was born, but when I think about the 80s, I was there, but for a little bit, you know, I think about, yes, like it being loud and big hair and colors and all of that. And then I think about like the crack epidemic and how that, you know, like influenced, you know, Black and brown communities. And I think about Reagan, it was Reagan, right? You know, I also think about 80s horror because that's my favorite type of horror. So there's like a lot of things that come up in my mind. Some of them like, yeah, this incites a positive feeling, and some of it is like, ooh. And so I think about, even like, again, as someone who has experienced and studies racial trauma, would we classify it as nostalgia? Like, for example, when I watch something like Lovecraft Country and think about what, you know, my dad my ancestors, what they endured. And I think back on that, and it incites a feeling in me. Would I categorize that as nostalgia? Or what I would categorize that as like an intergenerational trauma, like a vicarious trauma. Would that also be nostalgic in that there's this sort of looking back? You know what I'm saying?
No, I do. And I mean, I think in a way, also just in the context of shopping malls, you know, this kind of dead mall thing, it plays into this ruin porn, you know, this idea of kind of like this tourism for sites of basic economic deprivation. I think, you know, just kind of riffing on what you're saying there is in a way this risk of aestheticizing, you know, inequality, deprivation, things like this, that for the generations that come after, you know, stripping them from their context and treating it purely on a kind of surface level. That's, I think, another danger to be aware of in all of this.
Yeah, let me follow up on what you two were just talking about. You know, the Duffy brothers, they watch Spielberg movies over and over and over and over, internalize that, and the next thing you know, Stranger Things comes out of it. So if in fact our experiences are beautifully, hopefully, forever constrained by memory, right? If that's the case, then if we're going to discuss blind spots, there's perhaps a contradiction here in that we can't do the work without inducing blind spots. In other words, in order to focus on something, you necessarily ignore everything. And then does that mean that disruptive narratives like Watchmen, Them, Lovecraft Country, Candyman, Get Out, Black Panther, that these are stories that are recognizing those blind spots in those other narratives, and what we can hope for, the best we can do, is to get these other stories out so that this generation has them in there as part of their memories. So kids growing up with the MCU are never going to be able to forget Black Panther being part of that world. They're not just getting Iron Man anymore, right? They're getting this new world of narrative that will, I'm not going to say hopefully, I'm just going to assume that it will transform their understanding of memory and narrative.
I think I'm sorry, go ahead, Leanne. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that one of the things that, you know, Vanessa, as you were talking, I was thinking about is what I loved about talking about, you know, Lovecraft Country was that I did have my own nostalgia for that time period through my own, and like hearing everyone else talk, particularly, you know, you with your experiences, helped me see my blind spots, helped me learn more empathy, learn more about what those other narratives looks like and what trauma and intergenerational trauma looks like. So in some ways, those disruptive narratives, as you said, Scott, putting those right next to your own nostalgia, I think is a really good way of becoming more aware, becoming more, so my daughter just walked in. So
say hello to the dog.
Hi. Speaking of nostalgia.
Hi, baby.
Hello.
Okay, say bye. Go get the daddy. Anyway, that's all I was gonna say, was that I think that experiencing someone else's nostalgia can be a really great way of building your self-awareness and understanding. So we do that with our clients, right? Like we come to understand their nostalgia, their racial trauma, their intergenerational trauma. And I think that it's just a really cool way of looking at that in terms of exploring those blind spots.
And I think this idea of blind spots is interesting because I think it's important to understand that phenomenologically speaking, blind spots are individual. So like Scott's blind spots are not mine, or not Dylan's, or not Leandra's, because I think sometimes, I don't know what other word to use besides frustrating, right? So like something like Lovecraft Country, and we talked about this in the podcast, right? Shameless plug. We talked about this, which is like people who were like, this was their aha moment about racism and intergenerational trauma, was seeing it portrayed in that way. Whereas for a lot of people who experience that on a daily basis, it's like, of course that's a thing. Like, why is it, you know what I'm saying? And we talked about that frustration. So even to think about, I think when you talk about blind spots, that's exactly what I was going to ask, but Leandra already answered it. Like, whose blind spots are we talking about? Because mine would be very different than, you know, anybody else's. And so I think that's another because when we talked about, we talked about with Lovecraft Country, sort of like the impact. And I know we talked about, like, as educators, right, how we can use that to teach the next generation of folks. Just like you said, Scott, about the MCU, we can use some of these stories to teach the next generation of folks about different experiences.
Right.
And so, like, when we're commenting generally on like the blind spots of X, Y, and Z, it's important, I think, to denote that that's my opinion and those are my perspectives versus, someone else, because I think sometimes, especially when we're talking about popular culture, right? I think that, your interpretation is your own, and do you, and the way that I feel about that is my own too. You know what I'm saying? So even nostalgia, again, and I think that's the essence of phenomenology, right? It's an independent, I'm one of one, and I'm the only person who has that phenomenological experience.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important to understand too. It's not a shared thing.
Now we're getting to the cultural roots of phenomenology and coherence and truth, right? From a phenomenological perspective, truth is not an abstract phenomenon, it's coherence. And that's just not, we in this culture kind of commit ourselves to the notion of an abstract absolute truth. And we keep banging our stories up against, this is how it really happened. That's how it, as if we can describe reality independently of being. And when you get into the phenomenological continental space, it was created precisely to avoid that way of thinking, right? And how do we deal with truth and reality when we can't create fictions about an absolute beyond being? And we end up right where we are. And in this conversation, we end up with WandaVision. We end up with Get Out, right? We end up with these, I would argue, coherence-driven, phenomenologically embedded tales about this is what it's like to be me. I can't tell you what's true. All I can tell you is what I be. Right. And I put it out there, and
I think that becomes more difficult when we're talking about like suffering and oppression, because like as the oppressor, you have your phenomenological experience. As the oppressed, I have mine. And I think the issue is not in it is, but it isn't. I think the issue is not necessarily in the discrepant experiences of like the shared space of reality we have. I think it's in the devaluing. So because your experience, your phenomenological experience, again, it goes back to what Dylan was saying, it's sort of like is congruent with your narrative. Like it doesn't leave any space for you to accept any of like my experience as valid. And so I think, doing work in social justice and equity and all of that, I think that is probably one of the hardest things to do, is to really take the oppressor's experience as equally as valid as mine, because I'm suffering. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that it's hard, it's difficult, it's very, very difficult in those types of spaces. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think maybe one of the problems not only in addressing our own blind spots, but also, the very task of having a face-to-face encounter with another person and locating their own blind spots. I mean, first of all, the question has to be posed, who are we and in what position to articulate another person's blind spot? Because that sort of makes us, the source of illumination for them, when it's really should be their own responsibility. But then we're also in a situation of, what do we do with this? Do we keep this to ourselves? And if not, then is there some sort of ethical practice, presumably in the context of psychotherapy, where these blind spots can be dislodged in some sort of capacity? I mean, I think, the problem is that the blind spots are blind because they play a constitutive role in who we are. So they're not things that are foregrounded in our field of perception. They have a manifest articulation, a thematic articulation in our, experience of other people, in the judgments that we make. But that's just the sort of the manifest appearance. I think what actually, what is actually at stake is some sort of value that we either maintain because it plays a formative role in who we are, or we retain it because it's some sort of source of familiarity that we just keep sedimenting into our worldview through habitual practices and through cultural practices and whatever practices they may be. And of course, those practices are also reinforced not only by our own subjective entanglement with the world, but also with intersubjectively, and in the groups that we feel an affinity to, and who also presumably have tacitly or otherwise share these blind spots.
The clothes you wear, the job you have,
Exactly,
the education you have, the words you use, all of it sustains this this narrative. And when I talk to students about racism, I said, let's not talk about it being in your head. This is just ask yourself what stays the same in the world because of what you do. And yeah, every time you fill up your gas in your car, it sustains a certain context across the entire planet. Am I blaming you? That's not what we're doing here. I'm getting you to look at the world in terms of a story that you keep going by your being. And you have to then decide if you're going to suppress the story and happily jump into your story. And as Dylan said, then the more you jump into your story, the more you more robustly you negate the others, right? Or you actually allow yourself to be deconstructed a bit. You allow yourself to be destabilized a bit and deal with the anxiety of realizing that being is simultaneously creation and destruction. How do we deal with that? And that's not a narrative we tend to tell ourselves, at least in the culture I live in. We tend to tell a story of trying to become pure, trying to get to this transcendent space where we can overcome contingency and escape the curse of unintended consequences, which we just refuse to address. So yeah, that's exactly how I like to invite students to.
And Dylan, you mentioned like sort of like in psychotherapy, how do we get people to confront, understand, illuminate blind spots? And I think, again, from a existential phenomenological perspective, therapy is all about description. And so for me, I am walking with people in this process of really describing their experience to me, understanding that I can never understand fully, right? Because that's, phenomenologically speaking, I can't jump inside you and be you. I'm going to understand through my own filter, whatever. But the goal is really, it's like this sort of like phenomenological inquiry questioning that we do to really get people to dig and deconstruct what you just said, Scott. Why do you think these things? What got us to this place? Whatever. And it's not for me to then be like, aha, you see there? It happens just organically. It happens organically because, again, as people are called to confront and really, it's like an increased awareness and illuminate these, again, these structures. I don't want to say that. That sounds like way too technical, but this process of making meaning and valuing, like, that is what guides everything that we do, which is, again, informed by everything that's outside of us, right? So really understanding all of those ins and outs. And again, so for me, therapeutically, it's really about understanding someone's lived experience. And the only way I can do that is through description. It's not through valuing, like, was that good, bad, or whatever. It's, I just really want to understand. I just really want to understand what you experience. And in so doing, if there are blind spots, they come to the light. Like, as people are talking through that and again, I don't like this word, but that incongruence between who you think you are and how you live your life, you know what I'm saying? Like, that disparity, if there is one, it will come to light. And then what we work to really focus on is wherever you are, you place the value on that. So if it's not where you want to be, you're the one who gets to decide, like, oh, that makes me less than or whatever, and that's what we do in therapy. I mean, that's what we try to do. That's what I try to do. I don't know if it always works, but that's how we try to do that.
Do you factor in unconscious forces in this process in your therapy?
It depends. Because even the idea, to me, the idea of the unconscious it's a sticky one. I definitely use those words, but to me, unconscious is just outside of awareness, and it's not like the Freudian, like, ooh, like that type of unconscious. It's more so something that we have to bring to the light. And it's just like unconscious bias. Once we bring it to the light, it's now conscious, and you can do something with that. but we do that through, you know, again, trying to that description. And once people do have those aha moments, but they do that themselves. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Yeah, we
Well-
use a lot of narrative therapy for that. And so working with kids, you know, and the nostalgia really comes into that, because when I was working with children who had came to Texas as refugees. And so we had them do their story. Like, what was my favorite thing about back in my, you know, nation of origin? What was something I didn't like? What was something I loved? What was my favorite thing to do? And then how did I get here? And now what's my favorite? And so I think the process of narrative therapy and cinematography allows them sort of that creative way to take a step back and look at that bigger picture. And that's when they start to see some of those unconscious things. Something as simple as like a genogram, right? Where they go through their family tree. And one of the things that we'll do is we'll be like, well, you know, alcoholism. We'll put like a little bottle next to everyone who's experienced alcoholism. And then they start to see the bigger picture. And that starts to kind of give them that bigger view, not only of intergenerational experiences, but how that then is impacting them and how that's creating those sort of unconscious habits or thought processes that they have, or distortions. And so and that's why I love what you were saying, Dylan, too, because we do drive on nostalgia for those processes and telling their story and what does that mean. And you can see when the kids' faces light up, like what they're really feeling safe. And that tells me a lot when they're telling me a story about a safe place, like a mall. A mall was a safe place for me. So it was interesting watching Stranger Things and, you know, Fear Street, 1994, take that and just whip it around. It's no longer a safe space. So I think, like, to answer your question, Dylan, I think there are a lot of ways that you can do that. And again, it's not me saying what's right or wrong. It's you telling me your story, you processing that. I'm just here to facilitate and then help you process the emotions and the thoughts that you're having as you're going through that. But I think that's why we love pop culture, Vanessa and I both, because we see this play out. Like, this is the tool that we use, exactly what you're talking about, Dylan.
Yeah. Well, it's great to know that it has such a therapeutic function. I mean, I think it does for many of us on a sort of, you know, subjective individual level, just, you know, reliving stories, you know, sort of, you know, kind of revising how we understand them. But it's good to know that it can be used on a more kind of clinical level to deal with perhaps more significant modes of suffering.
Yeah, I think I'd love for conversations like this to sort of bring in a cultural understanding of being, in which we truly do come to experience ourselves as perpetuated narratives instead of getting it right, right? This notion of getting it right really gets in the way of accepting being. And you know, interestingly enough, when you generate your own nostalgia, you mentioned politics earlier, Dylan, when you're generating an oppressive political narrative, make America great again, right? When you're perpetuating that narrative, you're inviting people to your narrative, your happy place, purposefully excluding those who don't live there, while simultaneously pretending that what you're perpetuating is the right way. And this co-opting of the notion of right has a lot to do with why American culture is currently so bifurcated, right? Because both sides are right. On the left, we're logically right and irrationally right. And on the right, we're religiously right, or whatever it is. And both have a commitment to this absolute that prevents them from interacting as narratives. And I love these different takes that we've had on narrative and identity. If I could, I'd like to address the topic of ruins. Right. So Dylan, if you could just spend a moment bringing us back to this notion of ruins, and then we can flesh that out a little bit in terms of contemporary pop culture.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I mean, just as a sort of preface, it's although my work sort of kind of borders on ruins and is never too far from ruins in one way or another, I haven't really thought about ruins as material structures in a very long time. But certainly, just to give, if I may indulge just for a second, When I first started to think about ruins many years ago now, I was interested in the ways in which they can possibly contest pre-given ideas about rationality and progress. So, for example, certainly in the history of philosophy, in the history of 20th century philosophy and 19th century philosophy, there are tacit ways of thinking about reason and progress, and of course in a theological and religious context as well, as being kind of rather linear, as approaching some sort of moment of culmination, if you like. And I think what interests me more is how certain material structures and how certain kind of cultural artifacts are understood against this backdrop. So, certainly within phenomenology, which I like very much, but nevertheless I have reservations about, because I think in certain branches of phenomenology, there's a bias, a sort of humanistic bias towards certain kind of structural configurations. So, for example, in phenomenological geography, especially in the late 20th century, there is a certain bias towards an idea of place and towards an idea of home as being emblematic of an authentic place, or a place that has a rich sense of place. And very early on, as a kind of undergrad, and certainly as a graduate student, I was hostile to this, because I had this kind of appreciation, or I had this sense that there's a multiplicity of places outside of this small circumference of home, town, city, that impact our lives and has a significance upon us, whether or not we recognize it or not, and to some extent whether or not we like it or not. We pass through places, they impact us, they get under our bodies. Sometimes we don't understand. Of course, one kind of, or two explicit articulations that would be trauma, the way in which places can traumatize us. We don't quite recognize it, but it comes out in other sorts of symptomatic ways. And then, of course, nostalgia, the way in which a place, a banal place, or indeed a singular place like a home, can be transformed through one way or another, and then gain this sort of enchanted sense of meaning. And then in a way, this exclusion of certain places, I was also thinking about in the context of ruins. And here too, in the history of aesthetics, there's this sort of veneration of classical ruins and sort of 19th century ruins as fulfilling a certain idea of beauty. And then on the other hand, you have these kind of, again, this is quite a while ago, because the situation has changed rather rapidly. 15 years ago, this idea of like contemporary urban ruins was really at an embryonic stage. Of course, now with social media, it's kind of commonplace, but back then those sorts of places were on the periphery. I'm talking about like factories and abandoned mental asylums, and just the minutiae of life, really. And so that's my interest, and my interest is not only in reevaluating these places from an aesthetic perspective, which I think is a project of its own, but also in terms of our relationship to these ruins, what ruins can tell us about the role of imagination, memory, identity, and how through invoking a particularly kind of visceral affective experience, they can challenge, I think, a series of sedimented notions that I mentioned before about history, progress, identity, and so on and so forth, because they have this sort of sense of being constantly in motion, far from inert. They have this sense of being very, very dynamic, and so they're hard in a way to pigeonhole, or they're hard in a way to stabilize, and that I find certainly philosophically very, very rewarding and very substantial to think about.
And the notion that a ruin can disrupt our sense of temporality, right?
Yeah.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah, well, that's certainly one of the more interesting components. I mean, for example, it's very evident. Again, I'm just thinking a lot about Moors because I'm writing about them more generally, but you can think about it in the context of any contemporary ruin. And when I say ruin, I mean, I'm talking about like something that is kind of freshly ruined, so to speak, rather than, don't have anything sort of, I'm not talking about classical ruins. I'm not talking about statuesque ruins. I'm not talking about ruins I'm talking about, the strip mall, like the 7-Eleven that's been abandoned for a year or something, or, like a Kmart, Walmart, something like this. This to me is way more interesting and way more kind of philosophically rich than something in something in Greece or something, because it has this sense of, indeed, the configuration of multiple temporalities occurring at the same time. You have this forward motion of dissolution. You have this, encroachment of organic decay occurring in a place that has been neglected. You have, often this sort of sedimented past that is then brought to light because it's been abandoned for so long. So there are things about the place that are brought to light simply because it is no longer being attended to. And in a way, I think you've also seen that over the last year, because in a way, the lockdowns that have occurred have in a way engineered something like a sort of semblance of how a city would be after being deserted. There's all these narratives about nature sort of returning, and these processes of reclamation and so forth. So you get a sense of like another narrative of what happens when sort of anthropocentric perspective is temporarily suspended. And then, of course, in the midst of that kind of disjunction between this sense of organic decay and this sense of the past as being re-emerging, if you like, you have the spectator, the viewer in the middle, in the present, mediating these different temporalities with his or her own, subjective, cultural, whatever it may be, temporalities also playing a significant role in how these processes are shaped. So that I find very, very rich on a number of levels.
Yeah, so I love your reference to Merleau-Ponty and the notion of the absolute sense of presence being brought to the moment by our bodies, and how when we take our bodies into the presence of something we would call a ruin, it sort of denies us this continuous sense of present brought on by our bodies. It sort of disrupts our experience of time. And it's in those disruptions that we can, in a sense, become more aware, not unlike what goes on in a therapy session to some extent, right? So when I coupled that idea with recent data, the last 20 years indicates that, for example, when I watch another person walk, talk, speak, it turns out that my experience of their walking and talking and speaking is, at least to some extent, involves areas of my own brain that I would use to plan to do those very things. What that means is when I watch a TV show, I'm actually allowing those characters, the sounds, the sights to sort of hijack my planning. So the reason it's so robust is not because it's a picture I'm watching, it's because of planning states I'm being put into. You've all seen TV shows where there's a fight and you can see people in the audience, having these small muscular contractions as they're inhibiting doing what the characters on the screen do. What this implies then is when we're watching them, almost any movie is in itself a sort of ruin, in the sense that it disrupts our sense of time and place, in the sense that we're there in a theater or in our home, and we're allowing this artifact to sort of take over our planning and our emotions and such, disrupting our temporality a bit. And I wanted to just, ask everyone if they could talk a bit about a pop culture narrative you've experienced that sort of gets to this idea of being disrupted, gets to this idea of using nostalgia and ruins as a way to communicate?
Yes. So I'm sorry, I was like deeply in thought. Because as you were talking about, like, you know, watching the fight and people like, I'm reminded of, like, because horror is my first love. And just like when a lot of that torture porn body horror stuff started to come out, and how it's just fascinating to think about people's being drawn to that when you have that, you know, like, that's a whole conversation for a different day. Let's plan our next panel around that, because it just, that thought in my mind is, it's just wild. Anyways, but to your question, I think about, and again, a lot of the work I do is around, you know, racism, particularly anti-Black racism. So I think about a lot of the pop culture artifacts you referenced earlier, Scott. So like them, Get Out, He Who Shall Not Be Named. We're not going to say that name anymore. Right. That movie that just came out.
So sorry.
It's totally fine.
There's no mirror behind me though.
I don't want to take chances, but the new one, I think he'd leave me alone. Anyways, but there were, at the end of that film, the scene in the credits was like this puppet show. I don't know if you all have seen it, but if you haven't, please stay for the credits. There's this puppet show that sort of depicts these different traumas for different, you know, Black people. So we see the trauma of the original person and sort of what he experienced. Then we see real life traumas. We see George Stinney, who was the youngest person ever to be executed in the United States at the age of 14, a young Black boy. Then we see the trauma of Emmett Till, which you all know what that, and then we see like these are all like little paper puppets that they're doing. And I remember sitting in the theater, and I was already like on one, right? Because we just watched this whole movie and it was just too much. And then this is the last thing that we see, and I burst into tears. Like, I was just, it was like the straw that pushed me over. And I think it was the juxtaposition between these fictional narratives and these real life, you know, things that happened, and how in some ways you can't tell one from the other. Like, why is this mythical thing, you know, that the only thing that makes it fiction, I think, is that supernatural element, which again, that's a conversation for a different day, because maybe it's not really supernatural, I don't know. But I think that experience, when you talk about being disrupted, it was one of those where after that, me and my husband, who is a white man, which again, that context, I think in itself was, we experienced that movie in very different ways. He was the first person to break the silence. He said, that was a lot. And I said, yes, it was. And we literally rode home in silence, because there was a heaviness that, again, I can only speak to my experience, but I was disrupted, to say the least. And I think that, again, it was a combination of, you know, how I see myself, you know, as a Black person in America, the work that I do that's almost exclusively with Black people in therapy, the state of the world for Black people. And, you know, it was an experience. And I think that, and Scott, you, Leandra, we have talked about this, how it's hard for me to watch certain things because of that. I'm avoiding that disruption. I'm avoiding that experience, because it's just overwhelming at times. And I think about this idea of ruins. And I'm thinking about, and I know, Dylan, you mentioned ruins as like things that now we're not talking about ancient, and things that are actual physical sort of edifices. I'm thinking about ruins in a sort of more abstract sense when I think about like societies of or, you know, like ways of being of the past that are no longer. And I even think about my individual experience, you know, of becoming woke and now being so aware of all of these things. Sometimes I pine for, you know, the 16-year-old me that had no idea about any of this versus the me now who sobs at a movie like that. You know what I'm saying? And so when I think about a ruin, it's almost like, I don't want to say I was ruined, you know, when I, you know, gained this awareness and understanding, but sometimes it feels like that. It feels like, I wish I was that 7-Eleven, not this one now that's like all ripped to pieces, because now I have this awareness of you know, it's just, it was a lot. Even talking about this, like I'm getting tight in my chest because I'm thinking about that movie and just like that, it was intense. I think y'all should watch it. It was like super intense.
Well, I think Dylan's earlier comment about nostalgia as a kind of pill, you know,
Yes.
it shows this dialectic nature between nostalgia and ruins, right? And look, at some point I'm just gonna suck my thumb.
Yes.
I'm just gonna go back and watch SpongeBob, man, you know, because it's just too much. And because we don't understand ourselves as dialectical narratives, as contradictions, we're suddenly watching SpongeBob, sucking our thumb, getting ourselves back to, you know, feeling okay. And then we start to feel guilty because we're avoiding. Yes. Right? I mean, it's just ridiculous how much cost comes to our lives because we refuse to experience ourselves as dialectical, right? We refuse to experience ourselves as a beautiful, ugly contradiction, right? It's all got to be right. And it's taxing. And
and I think to that point, which for me, it's Family Guy. Like Family Guy is my which we can have a conversation about that a different day. But I think one thing that I have really worked to develop is, and this is where I think mindfulness is very useful, not the sort of appropriated version, but mindfulness I think is useful in that, you know, we recognize without judgment. And so recognizing in this moment, this is something that I want to do for myself, which is to disconnect and not judging that. Where, you know, like that's something that I struggle with too, you know, like watching these different things, like you need to watch this, you need to do this, you need to do that. Why do I need to do that? You know what I'm saying? And really getting to that place, like you said, Scott, where I can accept and understand that this is my experience and I'm the one who decides if it's valuable or not, or what should and shouldn't be. You know what I'm saying? With the understanding, like adding that layer that, you know, culturally, there's all these messages that I'm inundated with.
So absolutely. How about you, Leandra?
Yeah, I'm just
culture narrative.
Every time I'm just like, break. When I think of ruins, I think I'm a little bit like Vanessa too. Like I don't always think of like a physical ruin, but when you were talking, Dylan, I think what kept coming back to me were kind of two different things. One was and I always forget his name because he's like not the main character in Stranger Things, but the kid who gets lost in the other world. Like he's living in a world that's been completely torn apart, living in the ruins as a child. And then when he comes back, he's constantly being disrupted by these sort of normal reminders, right, of this world that he lived in, where he was surrounded by the ruins of his world from before. And I think that's such a great analogy for childhood trauma too, because oftentimes we always talk about getting back to that normalcy when understanding that like that doesn't exist. There's a new normal that we're trying to establish. And how do we deal with those ruinous moments that kind of take us back? So that was kind of what went through my head, was just, you know, the whole trauma of being stuck in that intersection with the ruins and the trauma. And the other thing was, I always go back to like Supernatural and how for them, ruins were home. Like whenever Dean tries to settle down and have a family inside like a four-wall house, he freaks out because that's his ruin. And we don't think of that as like a decrepit, decaying thing, but for him it is. And so it's almost the opposite, where he prefers the beaten up car, he prefers the shitty hotel rooms. I'm sorry, crappy motel rooms, the bunker, right? So like he's more comfortable in those decrepit, rundown ruins, those abandoned strip malls, those abandoned places, because for him the trauma is wrapped around this. The ruin has become the home, and so he just becomes so you could just see it. He does such a great job, right? Whereas Sam is the opposite. Like Sam doesn't remember the home, and so he just remembers the ruins of motel rooms, and he just remembers, you know, what it's like to be left alone in a place where you're the only two kids and there's no one else around but monsters. And so for him, he really wants to get away from those ruins and reestablish that sort of white picket fence American dream, which it's a whole again a whole other podcast that we can talk about in terms of what childhood trauma does to you. But I think that's why they get so enmeshed too, because their real ruin is each other. Like when they're around each other, they can get away. It's their SpongeBob. And it keeps them in a space where brotherly love and family and everything means more. So and so I just when
while
I was
they're on the road.
While they're on the road and they're in baby and like that's their place, that's their home, where I would look at that and while I absolutely love that car, that is not what I'm going to be driving every day, and I'm sure as hell not going to drive it across the country because that is a ruin, right? Like it's old, it's decrepit, it's falling apart. I'm not even going to talk about the impact on the environment, but so I just think it's so interesting, like how complicated you can really take that idea in terms of what really does the person experience as a ruin and how does that intersect with that childhood experiences that they've been having.
That's fantastic. And to go back to Dylan's notion of blind spots, both those brothers have different blind spots, right? But that chemistry and the character creation just compelled them to constantly be on the road saving others. So they had everything worked. It was their home and it wasn't a home in the sense, right? And I never really thought Kripke should watch what we're talking about here. I think
you really should, and that's why I think, and there are people are going to hate me for this, I think it should have ended after season 5 because the entire last episode, that's what it was about. It was about recognizing who those two characters were to each other, intersecting with these constant reminders of what it means to grow up the way that they did. As well as like good and evil and Lucifer and Michael and like all that other stuff. But so like I really think that Kripke did a great job in Swan Song of really showing what ruins, the way Dylan has described, and what they do for you in the moment and where it takes you.
And the cost of staying woke, right? I mean, in the sense that staying woke, not allowing yourself to collapse into a narrative, but have it be in this disruptive state. I don't know if it's sustainable, right? It's
like, nope.
And that's why when I find myself, I just tell my wife, baby, I'm sucking my thumb. We're going to watch SpongeBob because I can't. I just can't right now, because if I have to stay in this incoherent state, man, I'm just gonna make things worse.
And I feel like I view, and again, we could talk about the problematic nature of the term woke in another time, but this idea, I almost, interpret it just like, nirvana or self-actualization. It's not a state you get to that you're in all the time.
Yes.
It's sort of something that and I think that the desire to want to be in that state, it's just, to me, it's being woke is not about, it's not what it's a way of being. And I think that we're just, change is constant, right? Changes always. And so to even think that I'm just going to be this one way all the time, like I just don't.
Yeah, woke is not a goal. Like, it's not the goal. Like it's the process, and the goal is what comes from that.
Yes.
Like I tell people that all the time with social justice, like it's not a goal, it's a process.
Oh, Lord have mercy.
Equity, the goal
we're gonna stick around and do another panel.
No, but I mean, I'm just saying, like, I think that Dylan's talking a lot, but I want to bring it back to what you said, Dylan, where like it is that intersection, it is that phenomenon, it is what happens when nostalgia comes in there. It is a process.
Yep.
It is not goal oriented. And I think that we, particularly in this country, everything has to have an outcome. Everything has to be measurable. Everything has to come onto a chart. It has to be able to be graphed. It has to have profit. We can get into the whole capitalism destroying malls thing later. But you know what I mean? Like, so I think that people have a hard time with phenomenology and like what you're talking about, Dylan, sometimes because they're so caught up on, okay, what then? And it's like,
yes,
get it right.
What is the point of this? Yes.
Right.
We will have another discussion about anti-racism as a practice.
Yes.
And not a solution.
Yeah.
Right? I'm so tired of people acting like the job is to find the answer. We need to reorganize how we be. Right? I mean, and we need to turn it into practice, not a solution. So I quickly want to say a little something about my favorite disruptive. I shouldn't say my favorite. I just say the one that just kind of said, damn, Dylan, like, tell them to write this. And that was WandaVision. Because you have a woman who's been living, Dylan, you said you sort of rejected the notion that home is this place and we don't tend to think of all the other forces. Where does Wanda's character start? She's in Eastern European country, a bomb lands in her home and it's got Stark written on it. So the United States is there in her life then. And of course, the whole sitcom vibe of what she did with her family was watch American sitcoms. So that home is literally invaded, not just by American culture, but by American war, industrial war complex. And so she goes to Hydra, right? And then they train her, she becomes a whatever. But when when her brother dies in Ultron, saving someone, and then when Vision is basically murdered by Thanos, everything has been taken from her. There's no space for her to be. And so what we see in WandaVision is her using her power to generate her own ruin, right? She uses her power to take over a city and put spells on all these people to make them be characters in her memory. It's like the ultimate form of negation of the other, right? You just completely take over their identity and make them part of, you make everybody the cast for your show, right? And there's just these little things that happen. First of all, they actually manifested as this huge, I think it's actually a hexagon I saw. It's not a dome, it's a hexagon because it's a spell, right? That surrounds the city. And then there's these great lines where they get a probe in there and someone says like, someone's monitoring this space. Well, who's monitoring this space? Wanda's monitoring the space unconsciously, right? She's living in this space that is both the present and the past, even though it's not on her conscious awareness that that's how it's playing out. And then the cost of getting out of that space is that the cost of getting out of that nostalgia was the loss of Vision again, and the loss of her kids, right? And I just thought this is a beautiful visual manifestation of the notion of ruin, how it keeps present and past together in a sort of unaware way, but that shows up holistically in experience. And I thought, I don't know who Disney was talking to when they wrote it, but I thought, damn, you guys, this was good. And the way they played it out was, and then and then I'll shut up after this. The fact that she takes off just creates the best conversation about white accountability that you can have, right? She left. Now I guarantee you Marvel's gonna deal with that later. What does it mean that she had all that power? She left. She could have stayed, but she didn't. Why did she leave? Because I would argue she was in an incoherent state. She was scared she could hurt him again, whatever. At the same time, Marvel's going to have to talk about accountability. And I think that's why they had her go that way. So I absolutely love what they did with that show.
And
I mean,
everybody
I
else.
was gonna say, like,
No.
I think that I think she does build her own. She brings the ruins to her as opposed to going to them and experiencing them there. And I kind of think the same way. As much as I don't like Loki, but I got a whole thing about that. The void in Loki with all those ruins of all the possible outcomes fits really well with what you're talking about, Dylan, too. Like, because she kind of does the same thing where he's kind of thrown in to a literal void with literal ruins of all the decisions that's ever been made that got changed, right? So like, I think that's a good tie. And I think again, I just wanted to bring up the point that, like, how do we bring the ruins to us when we're in trauma and we're in grief? And that's interesting to me.
And I think it goes back to, I think the quote you used, Dylan, was like the past is like this stream of memories. And when I talk to my clients about the past, I often say, like, the past has the relevance that we give it in the present. And so when you're thinking about the past, you're thinking about it in your today being. So when you think about, time, which that's a whole other philosophical conversation we don't have to get into because I don't want to get confused. But when you think about time and memories, and I'm remembering the past as I am today. And so I can give it whatever relevance I want to. I'm never going to relive that moment ever, because I'm never going to be that person I was when that thing happened. And so when you think about what you said, Scott, too, about WandaVision, about her having the past and the present, there at the same time, I would argue that that's always our state, like when we're recalling something, and I use that term loosely, we're giving it relevance in our present being and in our present form. And so I think that's, which again, we could talk about Loki another time because I loved Loki. Oh my God. But I think that show was like an existential mind F for me, because I was like, this is wild. It was so wild. But I think that again, this idea of, which again, free will, we can talk about that at a different time, but how we make sense of the past and the present. And so when clients are dealing with trauma or whatever have you, that's part of trauma processing, right? Is how do you give relevance to that traumatic event now? It happened, there's nothing we could do about it. How do you relate to it now? Sometimes we're working to move from that relation from something that's very painful to something that is empowering, resilient. And so that's what, when Leandra was talking about narrative therapy, it's like, how do you write the story of that past? Because how it happened is how you say it happened. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, unfortunately, I haven't seen WandaVision, but it sounds intriguing, and certainly your collective discussion of it inspires me to see it, which I will tonight. But just picking up on your point there, Vanessa, about the past, I mean, I would agree. It's, sometimes it's as though we sort of treat the past as though it's some sort of discrete zone of time behind us that we sort of have to turn to as though it's static, untouched, and just waiting for us to kind of rediscover. But as you say, it's not quite how it works. The past does change, and moreover, it changes from the standpoint of the present, and it's something that is sort of continuously evolving. I think that's good in the sense that, it does have this dynamic quality to it, but I think it can also be unsettling insofar as we have to do away with this idea of having like an ultimate static origin that we can return to in order to sort of hypothetically see how things were. Which of course is just not the case.
Right.
We have to live alongside this more ambiguous and arguably more anxiety-inducing sense of the past. There's something more elusive and slippery that we play a significant role in constituting and redefining.
And I think that goes back to what I think you said it earlier, Scott, about if we take this understanding of, again, the past is dynamic and all of that, we have to also take into account that if you experience the past in a different way than I do, that both of those truths are valid. And again, I think that especially in America, we are not trying to hear any of that. And I honestly feel like that's what is attributing to a lot of the issues that we have now, is that lack of sort of critical thought and that lack of being able to just allow for other possibilities. So even in therapy, when we're talking about things, we're just opening space and allowing for other possibilities, because people often get stuck in a place where this is the thing and that's it. And in therapy, we're trying to open people's awareness to, like, it could be any number of an infinity amount of things, right? That how you interpret the world and yourself and your experience and all of that. And I think that what you're describing, that understanding of the dynamic nature of the past, people ain't ready for that conversation, because again, it's almost like when you get woke, it's like, well, damn, now there's, now there's so much. Now there's so much that I have to contend with. And it's like that sort of existential angst that there's so much that's overwhelming. So to protect myself from that, I'm going to put myself in this box, which this is it and nothing else.
Yep. And it's easier to live in that box. It is easier to live in that box, particularly if you're living in privilege. And if no one is cultivating a sense of openness, if no one in your world, if your world doesn't contain people that challenge you and push you and disrupt your, then you don't. And there are some individuals that are self-disrupting, right? That's fine. But they're not the dominant portion of the species. And so all you troublemakers, you self-disruptors, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I think at this point we'll go ahead and bring it to a close. What I want to do is give all of you the opportunity to tell the audience where they can find you on social media, and we'll start with Vanessa.
You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Vanessa _Hints. On Facebook, Dr. Vanessa Hints. On Twitter, at Dr. Vanessa Hints.
Fantastic. How about you, Leandra?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Paris Leandra.
Fantastic. How about you, Dylan?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I am at Dr. Dylan Trigg, and drop me a line. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Fantastic. You can find me on Twitter at dark_loops. You can find me on YouTube at the Dark Loops Productions channel. Folks, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you to Wayne Pop for giving us the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.